I'd like to ask you to put this more in the perspective of our global economy. Clearly, one of the great economic trends of the past 50 years is that the industrial heartland of America has moved from the Midwest to China, to India, to the developing world, and much of the production of the West is now in countries where the labor standards under which that production is made is far inferior to where it was made when it was here in Western Europe or the United States. It seems to me at this point an almost irreversible trend. How will that affect the future of American society in 20, 30, 40, 50 years?
Well, in some ways, it is a very reversible trend, because we have been supporting that purely by living off of consumer credit extended by the rest of the world. And the rest of the world's beginning to finally wake up to the fact that the U.S. dollar is not worth as much as we all thought it was, because our own economy is increasingly built on, and this has been an explicit policy, the growth of the financial sector is a percentage of our total economy. So we built an economy that assumes that that we can live by simply creating money out of nothing, advertising to sell goods and services produced in China, security services to maintain order in the face of breakdown, health services to make up for the fact that we're eating crummy, non-nutritious food and ingesting all sorts of toxins from the environment, and toxic waste cleanup. Now, this is not the foundation for much of an economy. The rest of the world is at some point going to stop sending us their goods and their food, because they're going to realize that they're much better off to eat that food themselves and to produce shoes for their own children rather than shipping to us. So either we get cracking on rebuilding our economy and our capacity to produce, or we're going to end up in a pretty desperate strait in the not-too-distant future. And, of course, while we're doing this, we need to rebuild all that around a model that is environmentally sustainable, which means our total consumption of material goods has to drop significantly. But if you put it in the context of, well, if we get rid of our military-industrial complex, if we begin to roll back our suburbs to begin to reform ourselves into more compact communities so that we eliminate our automobile dependence, if we start putting more of our energy into education and into primary health care and all the things that are essential to a good society, we begin to rebuild the relationships of community. People begin to find satisfaction in their jobs because they're really producing goods and services that help their neighbors, and they feel like they're contributing to their community. Now, the amount of adjustment that we have to make in order for all this to happen is huge, and that cannot be downplayed. We've been working 50 years to create this monstrosity of an economy that runs on a fossil fuel subsidy that's being withdrawn, and that is based on this premise that if we just make more money out of nothing, we are more prosperous. So this is kind of a wake-up call. We've been living in a trance.
David Korten, Inauguration Day. Wall Street experienced one of its greatest dives down. Very interesting. Yeah. As one said, Wall Street jeered as, while Washington cheered.
As the world cheered.
As the world cheered. You had, by the closing bell, the Dow Jones Industrial Average down 322 points, below 8,000. S&P 500 index dropped 45 points, more than 5%. It rarely goes below 1%. How is the Dow Jones related to real life? When it goes up, is that good for America? Is that good for the world? When it goes down, is that bad?
Well, the interesting thing is when it goes up, what it really means is that rich people are getting richer than the rest of us, or they're getting richer faster. And it's actually bad. Now, you know, if you really accepted it in the context of the way we're supposed to think about it, you know, that's generating more and more resources for productive activity. But in fact, most of the Wall Street funding is focused on funding speculation. And of course, most of the trading, at least 90% of the trading, probably more like 95% of the trading that goes on Wall Street, has nothing to do with funding real businesses. It's just exchanging pieces of paper. So you know, when the market goes up quickly, that's a financial bubble. It has absolutely nothing to do with anything related to real wealth. I mean, this is part of the insanity of it, that we have come to believe that a financial bubble is actually creating wealth, where it does absolutely nothing except create additional financial credits. And yet the business commentators are always talking about we created so much wealth was created in the market today, or so much wealth was destroyed. That's the phantom wealth.
And what part of some of your prescriptions for a way out of this economic quagmire do you believe that the team that Barack Obama is assembling, Larry Summers and Timothy Geithner and these others, will be able or even willing to try to address?
Well, certainly Summers is one of the ultimate neoliberal free market ideologues.
What does that mean?
It means he's been a promoter of the idea of unregulated markets. He was, by my understanding, he was actively involved in the dismantling of Glass-Steagall so that you could consolidate the depository banks with the investment banks, with the brokerages and so forth, which then get us into banks creating money by lending it essentially to themselves. And that's where the system really starts spinning out of control. You know, Timothy Geithner was head of the New York Federal Reserve, which really is considered to be the lead Federal Reserve organization, all during the time that they were going through the processes of deregulating the financial markets, and even the Federal Reserve pouring trillions of dollars in that go way beyond the bailout of the Treasury Department. So it's hard for me to see that these folks have a framework consistent with where we need to move, and that they have a recognition that Wall Street as we know it basically needs to be allowed to fail. And in fact, we should be putting in regulations not only not to make it work, but to stop the speculation. And if you stop the speculation, if you stop the usury, the excessive interest charges and so forth, Wall Street will in fact collapse. Now, I was fascinated. I hadn't heard this yet, but you mentioned that the government's starting to actually talk about takeover of some of the big banks. Now that, if they do it right, is potentially a right step.
Krugman has said nationalize the banks.
Yeah. Now, my sense of what we really need to do is nationalize the depository banks, let the hedge funds and private equity funds fail, but not with the idea that the government will permanently run the banking system as nationalized banks, but that they go through a transition of spinning those banks off into community banks, in a sense restoring the unitary banking system that we had some decades ago, where the banks were organized and functioned as local financial institutions where people could deposit their savings, and the banks could make loans to people that were buying a house or running a business, which is the way the system should be structured. Now, the other piece that we need to deal with is the whole question of how we create money, which is not very much publicly discussed, but moving from the current system where we essentially rely on banks to create money by lending it into existence, which creates all kinds of financial instability. And it also means that, in a sense, every economic transaction, we're paying rent to the bank for the money, when it's quite possible for government to spend the money into existence as it is needed to build a much more stable money supply. And that means that, that lowers taxes. in terms of the Obama stimulus package, people thought, where's that money come from? And it's very likely if we do it in the traditional way, we'll either borrow it from the banks, which means the banks will create it out of nothing, and we will be paying interest on it. Or if we borrow it abroad, it may be banks in China or Japan creating the money, which then we pay interest on. And it makes a whole lot more sense to develop a whole new orderly system by which the money is essentially issued by the federal government, and then we don't owe anybody anything.
What if the banks are nationalized? The taxpayers have to take on the bad debt, the bad assets, and then they reprivatize them when they get healthy?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think there's good reason to say don't take on the bad debts. Let them go into bankruptcy and then let them go into bankruptcy and then take over the assets to restructure. Now, this gets us into a huge additional problem in that in the creation of phantom wealth, and of course many of these derivatives and so forth were ultimately sold off to pension funds or to university endowments or local municipality trust funds or whatever. And you begin to look at that, and what you realize is that the total financial claims that were built up through that process far exceed any real wealth of the planet, which means that they are fictitious. They can never be realized. We've been treating money as a storehouse of value. What it really is, it can be a storehouse of expectations. But those of us who have, we may have comfortable retirement accounts, it's not clear how we're going to be able to redeem that, because there's not enough wealth in the society, of real wealth, of real people doing real things to maintain us at the level of our expectations. So all of this needs to be reworked out in this process of restructuring the financial system. And it's not going to be easy or comfortable.
Because when you talk about letting some of these big institutions go bankrupt, as you say, you're talking about pension funds of labor unions, government investments as well, universities.
Yes.
Everybody got involved in getting into the markets, and now everyone, to one degree or another, will pay from the unraveling of these markets. Yeah,
and part of the really insidious nature of it is the way the money managers are running the system. They're creating all of these fictitious transactions as a justification for collecting fees from the system, such as that some of the highest compensated hedge fund managers were taking home more than $1 billion a year in compensation. Now, that's where we need to do some serious taxation to recover that money. That's pure theft. And what they were really doing was raiding the equity of these funds, which was supposed to be the cushion against risk. And so again, this is a form of fraud that cannot be allowed to endure.
David Korten, what does the end of empire mean?
The end of empire. This puts it all in a historical context, and it very much relates to democracy. 5,000 years ago, as a species, we moved away from more community-oriented forms of organization. We began to organize ourselves by dominator hierarchy. I refer to that period of the move to empire, and it was not just about one nation dominating another, but it was about a dominator hierarchy at all levels of society, from the relationships among nations to relationships within families, relationships between gender, between races, and so forth. Now, we have gone through some democratizing processes, but the fact is we are still in that era of empire, of organization of society by dominator hierarchy. And whereas the rulers used to be kings and emperors, they are now corporate CEOs and hedge fund managers. And the system has morphed into where the real rule in society, put aside all our elections, democracy, and so forth, the real rule has been by Wall Street institutions through the system of money as a system of power.